Good morning, everyone who's tuning in to this South Church service this morning. I'm so grateful to be here with you all again, connected by the miracle of binary codes of zeros and ones from my home in the Catskills Mountains of New York, to be with you wherever you are. I was honored to ask to speak to you again, this time on the topic of healing. For today is a wonderful day. It's the season of Thanksgiving, my favorite of all of the American holidays. And those of the Hindu faith have recently celebrated the Diwali, Hindu festival of lights, symbolizing the human urge to move toward the light. However, Thanksgiving Day for those of the Baha'i faith is a time to remember the ascension of Abdul Baha, whose funeral in 1921 was marked by the governor of Jerusalem as something new. Because when Baha's coffin was carried up slowly up the slopes of Mount Carmel, it brought together those of the Muslim, Jewish, Christian, and Druze faiths. The governor wrote that no less than 10,000 people representing every class, religion, and race in that country had gathered together to mourn his death, but also rejoicing for his life. Today is also the beginning of the season of Advent, from the Latin advenio, meaning to come, marking the 4 Sundays before Christmas, with the lighting of the candles of the Advent wreath. The circular wreath of evergreens represents the infinity and unity of God and holds 4 or 5 candles, depending upon the Christian denomination, symbolizing faith, hope, love, joy, and peace. The candle being lit today in churches around the world embodies hope. And tomorrow is the birthday of Guru Nanak, the first guru of the Sikh faith, who denounces any type of duality or hypocrisy. He stressed the idea of God's oneness, that the creator, preserver, and destroyer are one. And tomorrow is also the feast of Saint Andrew, patron saint of several countries, whose humble beginnings as a fisherman led a life performing many miracles, which in my research were compared to today's stories of superheroes. It will also soon be Bodhi Day, when the Buddhists mark the enlightenment of Siddhartha. And as we move toward the darkest night of the year in the Northern Hemisphere, when the Yule festivities rejoice at the return of the light. So even though the days are short and filled with darkness, it is a time of multiple celebrations. So why do some days just feel so dismal? When I was here in February, I spoke to you about resilience and my battle with ovarian cancer. I mentioned to you my belief that all things are woven into a fabric of the universe, and that this is how I envision God. I said that I've come to believe in an infinite energetic fabric of light and love, and that each of us are woven into it and connected both here in our hearts and in our head as we speak. Maybe the members of the South Church are here in this corner, and maybe the folks down the street at the Buddhist temple are here, and the Jewish temple are here, and all the people at home sleeping or doing the crossword on Sunday are here, along with the animals and plants, and they're all woven into this fabric. And I do my best not to rip holes in the fabric where I am, as I understand how that affects the overall strength of the fabric. However, since that morning that I spoke to you, with the pandemic, the elections, the protests, the riots, the debates, it feels at times as if the fabric that I cherish has been rent into. So how do we heal this divide? How do we patch up our hearts like that man in Jen's story? Or repair our vessel with gold in Jonathan's opening words? How do we repair this rip? As a sometimes seamstress, I like to think about sewing the pieces together, maybe in a quilt, and maybe darning the odd hole, or using other closures like ties or buttons or zippers. And if we think of how doctors repair a wound to the body with stitches, making the wound smaller to aid the healing, this may not be such a bad idea. Though in February I spoke about my Gathering Goodness project, I also did a sculptural project called The Atlas of My Experience, about the trauma and recovery of my body and mind during my cancer journey. In the life-size figure, I placed a wine bottle with a 2012 vintage because that was the size and vintage of my tumor. I also made the incision site a zipper because my incision was sealed with staples, but also because the two sides had to be pulled back together to form a bond that felt very fragile, but would reunite my core muscles and thereby my strength. I filled the mind of my mannequin with dates, affirmations, and aphorisms because these desperate things jumbled in my mind and yet felt interconnected, short circuiting, and crazy making. And for the heart, I used a glass bottle to hold my hopes and dreams on which a butterfly sits flapping its wings. All of that is tucked away behind an ornate wooden cage because it seems to me that our hearts can so easily be shattered as well as glow with beams of love. As I'm not a medical professional, I felt I needed to do research on healing before I talked to you. And I learned that a wound heals in 4 stages. The first thing the body does is try to stop the bleeding by forming blood clots or hemostasis. The second stage is when the blood vessels around the wound narrow and platelets begin to form clumps to plug the wound. And they use a glue-like substance called fibrin to hold the plug in place so that the wound can scab over. There's a certain amount of inflammation and the area may be warm to the touch. This actually means that help has arrived in the form of white blood cells, or the macrophage, which fight off and digest bacteria and other harmful organisms to ward off infection. And that fresh blood continues to come to the site filled with oxygen and white blood cells to keep just the right balance. And those macrophages send out chemical message that encourages the body to clean and heal itself. And once the wound is clean and stable, the rebuilding phase begins. Oxygen-rich blood comes to the wound to make new tissue, and at this stage, you are likely to see a raised red scar, which may in time slowly flatten and fade in color. And the final stage is the maturation or strengthening phase. And though you may feel tightness or itching around or over the area, your body is continuing to repair itself. Most wounds heal in about 3 months, according to Johns Hopkins, with surgical wounds healing the fastest in just 6 to 8 weeks, though deep wounds may take up to a few years to heal completely. Now, I wish I'd written the service before the election. I wasn't such a procrastinator waiting for the perfect metaphor to float to the top. I thought I'd use the metaphor of the zipper and fitting together one and another from each side to pull the two sides of our country together, healing the body politic of our nation. It's difficult in the current state of our nation to imagine that this wound we share can heal without a help of something like doctor sutures. I like to envision that as a country, we are in the healing process and that the many marches and peaceful protests that have happened around the country are like the clumping of the white blood cells to form that plug to stop the bleeding in our democracy. A time of inflammation, which encourages the body to heal itself by eating prejudice and injustice rather than turning toxic and becoming infected with violence and misinformation. I like to think that the risk of infection is less so in a congregation like South Church, a congregation that celebrates the worth and dignity of all people and acts on its faith in the larger community. But there can still be rifts in those communities between friends and families, and I'm not sure how to heal that except to perhaps see those with differing points of view as an aspect of ourselves and that we're all part of that larger fabric. And if you know yourself to be a person who does their best at any given task that you care about, trust that most other people are also giving their best. WebMD tells me that there are ways that we can aid in healing. The first is by doing regular self-checks to avoid complications and infections. For me, this means checking my judgment, trying to respectfully hear what the other person is saying, and listening for their why, so I can avoid reopening a wound or pushing a relationship towards toxicity. I spend perhaps too much time on Facebook, where I am connected to people that I care about and respect, many of whom have entirely different points of view as to the solution that the world needs now. I do my best to understand their perspective because they are part of the universal fabric. And if we can't remain lovingly connected, I don't know how we'll pull and stitch that fabric back together. Other actions that WebMD says can help healing are to remove dead tissue, keep dressings fresh, and keep the pressure off the area. I like to keep things fresh by trying to find things to agree upon. On It's a nice day, how much we love our pets, a good book or a movie that we just saw, anything that can help bring us together. I keep the pressure off, though, by recognizing that some differences may not easily be ameliorated. So at times, I may to respectfully acknowledge the disagreement, agree to disagree, and withdraw from the media and social settings to focus on what feeds my soul and heals my heart before trying to connect across the divide again. You may have heard a Jewish friend say something like they did a mitzvah when they did a good deed. I remembered as I meditated for this sermon, a friend saying that each mitzvah performed repairs the shattered vessel and moves us towards tikkun olam. I didn't know enough about this myth, so I researched it. I found that mitzvah actually means divine commandment. And I also discovered that the 16th century rabbi Isaac Luria of Safed, also known as the Ari, was the creator of the sacred story of creation that I would like to share with you. In the beginning, God filled the universe. When God decided to create the world, he had to contract himself by drawing in his breath. Don't you love that image? And from the contraction, darkness was created. And when God said, "Let there be light," the light that came into being filled the darkness, lit by 10 holy vessels that came forth, each filled with primordial holy light. And God sent forth those 10 vessels, carrying light into the universe, but the vessels, being too fragile to hold such a powerful and divine light, broke open, shattering and sending holy sparks of light, like seeds as numerous as sand, or like the stars. These sparks fell everywhere. This creation story goes on to say that this is why people were created, to gather the sparks no matter where they are hidden, and that when enough of the holy sparks have been gathered, the broken vessels will be restored, and tikkun olam, the repair of the world so long awaited, will finally be complete. Therefore, it should be the aim of all to raise these sparks from wherever they are imprisoned and elevate them to holiness through the power of their soul. As a country, it seems to me that we've been watering seeds filled with fear and division instead of those filled with light, compassion, and love. But it's time to start the rebuilding phase for this national wound, to bring the two sides of the zipper together to heal the divide so that we can move forward to the strengthening phase, to pick up the shattered pieces of our glass hearts and the sacred vessels on both sides. We can do this by being fully present, truly listening to others' views and what might lie beneath the surface. I believe really that we all want the same things. I was not blessed with children, but I envision a country where your daughters, sons, and grandchildren have the ability to be themselves openly with the dignity that is their birthright, to feel safe because there is equal protection under the laws, and that they can get a good education without breaking the bank, and that they get to work at a job that they're good at and hopefully that they'll love, and that there's a healthcare system that they can afford to access when they need healing that doesn't cripple them financially. I want our collective children to be able to make a living wage in 40 hours a week or less, so that they can spend time with their families, to be able to be productive, engaged, and thoughtful members of their communities and their countries, performing mitzvahs as part of their daily routines. So, like the hymn that we shared earlier, it's time to say yes, to come together in spirit of Advent, a day of hope, to set aside our differences as the mourners of Abdul Baha and rejoice in life. As we listen to one another and gather those fragile, glowing shards, may we recognize, like the old man's heart in Jen's story, that among the tiny pieces of glass of our heart, that some of those fragments were given to us by others who may not agree with us or look like us. Let us say yes to life, to truth, to love. And let us hope that as we perform our mitzvahs, that like Jonathan's broken vessel, we have filled the cracks not with golden medals, but with the warm, golden light of love, compassion, understanding, and faith. Thank you for letting me be with you today.